The commander's hand was already raised, ready to deliver a humiliating slap in front of 234 elite warriors, when Frances Anderson did something that would shatter every assumption about the quiet, European girl who'd been dismissed as too emotional, too weak, too insignificant to belong in their sacred training grounds. What happened in the next 30 seconds would transform her from the Academy's most overlooked recruit into a legend that would be whispered about for decades to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the Valerian Combat Academy as Frances Anderson stood at the edge of the training courtyard, watching steam rise from her untouched cup of tea. At 19, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made people's eyes slide past her without pause. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, her uniform always perfectly pressed. Yet somehow she remained invisible among the 234 warriors in training who filled the Academy's ancient halls. The Academy hummed with its usual pre-dawn energy, steel clashing against steel, instructors barking orders, boots thundering across stone floors as the elite trainees prepared for another day of brutal conditioning. Frances had been here for 6 months, and every morning felt identical. She was a ghost in combat boots, present but unnoticed, competent but unremarkable at barely 5'4", with a slender frame that looked more suited to a university library than a warrior's training ground. Frances stood in stark contrast to her fellow recruits. The Academy attracted the strongest, the fastest, the most naturally gifted fighters from across Europe. They were the sons and daughters of military families, former street fighters who'd earned their way through raw talent, athletes who dominated their sports before turning to combat training. And then there was Frances Anderson, the quiet girl from a small village outside Praga, whose application had somehow slipped through the selection process like a bureaucratic accident. Her fellow trainees had nicknamed her library behind her back, though never with malice. She was the person who helped others with their written assignments, who knew exactly where every piece of training equipment belonged, who could recite the Academy's honor code word for word. When it came to the real training, the sparring sessions, the tactical exercises, the demonstrations that mattered, she was always assigned to support roles, equipment management, form documentation, injury assessment, always watching from the sidelines while others engaged in the combat training she'd come here to master. The most frustrating part was that Frances understood their reasoning. In hand-to-hand combat, size and strength mattered. When lives were on the line, physical advantage could be the difference between victory and defeat. But understanding their logic didn't make the dismissal any less painful, especially when she knew capabilities they couldn't see. Commander Victor Kraus stood at the center of the main training hall, his weathered face stern as he addressed the morning assembly. At 52, Kraus was a legend in European military circles, a former Special Forces operator who'd built the Valerian Academy into the continent's most prestigious combat training facility. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he announced the day's training rotation. "Advanced combat techniques will be led by myself," Kraus declared, his eyes scanning the assembled trainees. "I want Anderson, Martinez, Volkov, and Chun in the equipment preparation area. The rest of you, prepare for close-quarters combat scenarios." Frances felt the familiar sting of exclusion as her name was called for logistics duty once again. Around her, the selected trainees exchanged excited glances and confident nods. This was what they'd come for: direct training with the legendary Commander Kraus, learning techniques that could save their lives in real combat situations. She gathered her equipment list and headed toward the storage area, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. Behind her, she could hear the eager chatter of her fellow trainees as they prepared for advanced training she wasn't considered ready for. What none of them knew was that Frances Anderson had been preparing for this moment since she was 12 years old. In the quiet of the equipment storage room, Frances allowed herself a moment of stillness that she never showed in public. Her hands, which appeared delicate to casual observers, bore calluses that told a different story. Calluses from years of training that had nothing to do with the Valerian Academy's curriculum and everything to do with a promise she'd made to herself long ago. The village of Zernahora, where Frances had grown up, sat nestled in a valley 40 kilometers from Prague. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where traditions ran deep, and where her grandfather, Joseph Anderson, had been both the town's most respected citizen and its most carefully guarded secret. Joseph Anderson had fought in 3 different conflicts across 2 decades, but his real expertise lay in something far more specialized. He was a master of systema, the Russian martial art that emphasized fluid movement, breathing, and the ability to neutralize opponents, regardless of size differential. More importantly, he'd recognized something in his granddaughter that no one else had seen. Frances, he'd told her when she was 12, watching her defend a younger child from bullies with an instinctive grace that surprised even him. Your body is small, but your spirit is vast. Let me show you how to make them match. For 7 years, every morning before school and every evening after homework, Frances had trained with Joseph in the barn behind their house. Not the flashy tournament style martial arts that won trophies, but the practical, devastating techniques designed for survival. Systema didn't rely on strength or reach. It relied on understanding human anatomy, on reading movement patterns, on turning an opponent's force against them with surgical precision. Joseph had taught her to breathe through pain, to remain calm under pressure, to see openings that others missed. More crucially, he'd taught her to hide her abilities, to let others underestimate her until the moment she chose to reveal her true capabilities. A warrior's greatest weapon, Joseph often said, is not their strength, but their opponent's assumption about their weakness. Now, as Frances organized training equipment with methodical precision, she practiced the breathing techniques that had become second nature. Each inhale centered her focus. Each exhale released the frustration of being overlooked once again. She could hear the sounds of combat training from the main hall, the sharp crack of strikes being blocked, the controlled breathing of fighters engaged in complex combinations, the occasional grunt of impact. She'd memorized every technique they were learning, had studied the academy's entire curriculum during sleepless nights when homesickness and determination warred in her chest. The Valerian Academy's methods were impressive, but they were built around the assumption that bigger, stronger fighters would face opponents of similar size and training. Joseph's teaching had been different, designed around the reality that she would always be smaller, would always be underestimated, and that both facts could become advantages with the right preparation. The storage room door opened, interrupting her thoughts. Martinez, one of her fellow logistics assignments, entered with his typical frustrated expression. "Another day counting gear while the real warriors train," he muttered, grabbing a clipboard from the wall. "I didn't come here to be a glorified accountant." Frances nodded sympathetically, though her reasons for frustration were different from his. Martinez was genuinely suited for logistics, organized, detail-oriented, naturally administrative. He'd been assigned to support roles because it matched his strengths. She'd been assigned here because others couldn't imagine her strengths. "At least we're learning the Academy's systems," Frances offered diplomatically. "Understanding how everything works together has value," Martinez snorted. "Easy for you to say library. You seem content with paperwork. Some of us came here to actually fight." The nickname stung, as it always did, but Frances kept her expression neutral. Martinez didn't mean to be cruel. He simply couldn't conceive of her having the same ambitions he did. In his worldview, people like Frances were naturally suited for support roles, just as people like him were naturally suited for combat training. They were both being denied that as they worked through the equipment inventory. Frances found her attention drawn to the sounds from the main training hall. She could identify each technique being practiced by sound alone. could visualize the combinations and counters being demonstrated. More than that, she could see the weaknesses in their approach, the openings that Joseph would have exploited. The assumptions about combat that real-world experience had taught her were dangerous. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm, but Frances noticed subtle changes in the academy's atmosphere. There were whispered conversations between instructors, meaningful glances exchanged during briefings, a sense of anticipation that suggested something significant was approaching. She'd learned to read these institutional moods during her months here, had developed an intuition for when routine was about to be disrupted, that it was during the afternoon equipment inspection that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. Commander Kraus stood in his office reviewing training reports when senior instructor Helen and Novak entered with a concerned expression. Through the partially open door, Frances caught fragments of their conversation as she inventoried equipment in the adjacent storage room. "Anderson S performance evaluations are unusual," Novak was saying, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd spent 15 years training elite fighters. "Her written assessments are flawless. She understands combat theory better than trainees who've been here twice as long." Kraus looked up from his papers, his weathered face showing mild interest. "And the problem is?" "The problem is that she's spending time studying materials far beyond her clearance level. Advanced joint manipulation techniques, pressure point applications, combat psychology texts that are restricted to senior students." Novak placed a stack of reports on his desk. "She's been accessing the library archives after hours, checking out materials that have nothing to do with equipment management." Frances felt her pulse quicken as she continued organizing supplies, keeping her movements steady despite the conversation that was dissecting her dedication like a specimen under a microscope. She'd been careful about her research, but apparently not careful enough. "Are you suggesting misconduct?" Kraus asked, though his tone suggested he found the idea mildly absurd. "I'm suggesting inappropriate focus," Novak replied. "Anderson seems to believe she's destined for combat training despite clearly being suited for support roles. This kind of misplaced ambition can be disruptive to unit cohesion." Through the crack in the door, Frances could see Kraus studying her file. Victor Kraus had built his reputation on reading people, on identifying potential in unlikely places, but he was also a traditionalist who believed that physical capability was the foundation of all combat effectiveness. "Her grandfather was military," Kraus noted, flipping through pages. "Special operations, according to her application background." "Which explains the unrealistic expectations," Novak said dismissively. "Family military history often creates delusions of capability in unsuitable candidates." "She's been here 6 months and still seems to think she belongs in advanced training." Frances felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to continue working methodically. This was exactly what Joseph had warned her about: the moment when preparation would be interpreted as presumption, when dedication would be seen as delusion. The conversation in Kraus's office grew more specific, more damaging. Other instructors joined the discussion, adding their observations about Frances's concerning behavior patterns. She studied too much, asked too many questions, showed too much interest in techniques she'd never be qualified to use. "I've seen this before," said Instructor Petrov, his Russian accent thick with certainty. "Small candidates who compensate for physical limitations with academic overachievement. It's admirable in its own way, but it creates unrealistic self-assessment. The real concern," Novak continued, "is how this affects other trainees. When support personnel start believing they're combat material, it undermines the natural hierarchy that keeps everyone focused on their appropriate roles." Frances heard footsteps approaching the storage room and quickly busied herself with inventory sheets. Instructor Chun appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral but his eyes calculating. "Anderson," he said evenly, "report to Commander Krause's office when you finish here." The words hit like a physical blow. Frances nodded professionally, but her mind raced through possibilities. A direct meeting with Krause could mean reassignment, disciplinary action, or worse, dismissal from the academy entirely. As Chun walked away, Frances found her hands trembling slightly as she completed the equipment count. Around her, the storage room felt smaller, more confining. She'd worked so hard to remain invisible, to avoid the exact scrutiny that was now focused on her like a spotlight. The irony was bitter. Her fellow trainees dismissed her as library because she seemed content with academic study, while the instructors now viewed her academic study as evidence of inappropriate ambition. She was trapped between two perceptions, both of which denied her the opportunity to prove her actual capabilities. 20 minutes later, Frances stood outside Krause's office, her uniform perfect and her expression composed despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Through the door, she could hear the tail end of the instructor's discussion. Needs to understand her limitations before those limitations become dangerous to herself and others, Krause was saying. Misplaced confidence in combat situations gets people killed. Frances knocked on the doorframe, her knuckles steady against the wood despite everything. "Enter," Krause commanded. She stepped into the office to find herself facing not just Commander Krause, but Senior Instructor Novak, Instructor Petrov, and Instructor Chun, 4 of the Academy's most senior staff, all focused on her with expressions ranging from stern to openly skeptical. The tribunal had been set. Frances stood at attention in the center of Commander Krause's office, surrounded by 4 instructors whose collective experience represented decades of combat training and military service. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight her small frame, emphasizing the physical disparity between her and everyone else in the room. "Anderson," Krause began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "we need to discuss your focus during your time at this academy." "Yes, sir," Frances replied, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Senior Instructor Novak stepped forward, holding a folder thick with documentation. "We've been reviewing your library access records, your study patterns, your requests for additional materials. There's a concerning pattern here." Frances waited, knowing that any defensive response would only confirm their suspicions about her attitude. "You've been studying advanced combat techniques," Instructor Petrov said, his Russian accent making each word sound like an accusation. "Joint manipulation, pressure point applications, psychological warfare tactics. These are materials reserved for senior combat trainees, not support personnel. You've also been observed analyzing combat demonstrations with unusual intensity," added Instructor Chun, "taking detailed notes on techniques that have no relevance to equipment management or logistic support." Krause leaned back in his chair, studying Frances with the calculating gaze that had made him legendary in European military circles. "Anderson, do you understand why you were assigned to support roles rather than direct combat training?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Frances knew that her answer would determine not just this conversation, but her entire future at the academy. "Sir, I understand the reasoning behind the assignment," she said carefully. "Physical compatibility with combat requirements is a primary consideration in training placement." "Exactly," Novak said, her tone suggesting relief that Frances wasn't going to be difficult about this. "Physical capability is the foundation of all combat effectiveness. Without it, technique becomes theoretical exercise rather than practical application. Which brings us to the problem," Krause continued. "Your behavior suggests you believe you should be in advanced combat training despite being physically unsuited for such roles. This kind of misplaced ambition can be dangerous, Anderson, not just for you, but for any unit you might eventually serve with." Frances felt the walls closing in around her, felt the careful composure she'd maintained for 6 months beginning to crack. These weren't cruel people. They genuinely believed they were protecting her from herself, protecting future teammates, from her limitations. Their certainty about her incapability was absolute and well-intentioned, which made it infinitely more crushing than simple prejudice would have been. "Sir," she said, measuring each word carefully, "I believe that understanding combat principles makes me better at supporting combat operations. The more I understand about what fighters need, the better I can anticipate and provide for those needs." Petrov exchanged a glance with Novak. "That's admirable, Anderson, but the level of detail in your studies goes far beyond support requirements. You're studying combat techniques as if you expect to use them personally." "Because I do expect to use them," Francis said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. 4 instructors stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to barely contained exasperation. "Anderson," Krauss said, his voice dangerously quiet, "are you under the impression that your support role assignment is temporary? That you're somehow working your way up to combat training?" Francis met his gaze directly, knowing that this moment would define everything that followed. "Sir, I believe that capability should determine role assignment, not assumptions about." "Capability," Novak actually laughed, a sound without humor. "Assumptions?" "Anderson, we base assignments on measurable criteria. Height, weight, strength assessments, speed evaluations, endurance testing. These aren't assumptions, they're objective measurements." "With respect, ma'am," Francis replied, feeling Joseph's voice echoing in her memory, "those measurements test specific types of capability. They don't test adaptability, technique efficiency, or tactical intelligence." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Krauss stood up slowly, his full height imposing even from across the desk. "Anderson," he said, his voice carrying a warning that was unmistakable, "you are dangerously close to suggesting that this academy's selection criteria are flawed. That decades of proven methodology are somehow inadequate because they don't recognize your particular ... talents." Francis realized she'd reached the point of no return. She could back down, apologize, accept the limitations they'd placed on her, and spend the remainder of her time at the academy counting equipment while others learned to fight. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences followed. "Sir," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I'm suggesting that capability can't always be measured by traditional metrics. Some fighters succeed through strength and speed. Others succeed through technique and intelligence. The Academy's current system only identifies one type." Petrov stepped forward, his expression hardening. "And you believe you represent this alternative type of fighter that we've somehow overlooked? I believe I deserve the chance to prove what I'm capable of, rather than being limited by others' assumptions about what I can't do." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Francis could see the instructor's expressions shifting from concern to genuine anger. She'd crossed the line from misguided ambition into open defiance of their professional judgment. Commander Krauss walked around his desk until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Anderson," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "you will focus on your assigned duties and abandon these inappropriate studies. That is a direct order. Any further evidence of overreach will result in immediate dismissal from this academy." Francis felt something break inside her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Understood, sir." "I hope it is understood," Krauss continued, "because your next mistake will be your last one here." 2 weeks passed after Francis's confrontation with the command staff, and the academy felt different around her. Word of her meeting with Commander Krauss had spread through the informal networks that existed in any military institution, creating ripples of whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed her through her daily routines. The change was subtle but unmistakable. During equipment briefings, her suggestions were met with polite dismissal rather than consideration. Her requests for additional supplies took longer to process, requiring multiple approvals that had never been necessary before. Even her fellow support staff seemed to be keeping their distance, as if her supposed insubordination might be contagious. That Frances adapted by becoming even more invisible than before. She completed her assigned tasks with mechanical precision, spoke only when directly addressed, and avoided any behavior that might be interpreted as overstepping her role. But the isolation was taking its toll. The worst part was the loss of her sanctuary. The academy library, which had been her refuge during off-duty hours, was now monitored. Instructor Novak had made it clear that Frances's reading materials would be subject to review, that any access to restricted materials would result in immediate disciplinary action. So Frances sat in her small dormitory room during the long evenings, staring at textbooks on supply chain management and equipment maintenance. While down the hall, she could hear the excited conversations of combat trainees discussing their latest lessons. The sounds of their growth and development served as a constant reminder of opportunities being denied to her. It was during one of these lonely evenings that her roommate, Maria Santos, approached her with obvious reluctance. Maria was one of the few other women in the academy's support division, a medic trainee from Barcelona who had always been friendly but never particularly close. "Frances," Maria said, settling onto her own bed with careful formality, "I need to ask you something. And I hope you'll be honest with me." Frances looked up from her maintenance manual, sensing the seriousness in Maria's tone. "Of course. Are you planning to do something stupid?" Maria asked bluntly. "Because there are rumors going around, and some of them are concerning." Frances felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of rumors?" "That you're angry about the meeting with Commander Kraus. That you feel like you've been treated unfairly. That you might be planning to prove a point somehow." Maria's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "People are saying you might try to challenge the system directly." The accusation hit Frances like a physical blow. The idea that her frustration was being interpreted as potential insubordination, that her desire to prove herself was being seen as a threat to academy discipline, felt like another layer of isolation being wrapped around her. "Maria," Frances said carefully, "I have no intention of doing anything that would violate academy regulations or endanger anyone's safety." "But you do feel treated unfairly," Maria pressed. "Everyone can see that, and honestly, some of us understand why. You're clearly intelligent, clearly dedicated. It must be frustrating to be limited to support roles when you have broader ambitions." Frances chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation would likely be reported to the instructors. "I'm here to serve in whatever capacity I'm assigned. My personal feelings about those assignments are irrelevant." Maria studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Frances, I'm going to be direct with you. There are people here who think you're a potential problem. They're watching for any sign that you're going to act out, and they're prepared to recommend your dismissal if they find it." The revelation shouldn't have been surprising, but it still felt like a punch to the stomach. Frances had spent 6 months trying to prove herself worthy of opportunities that were never going to come. Now she was spending her time trying to prove she wasn't a threat to the institution that had already decided her fate. "I appreciate the warning," Frances said quietly. "It's not just a warning," Maria continued. "It's advice. Whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever you're planning, don't accept your role here, complete your training, and find a way to be satisfied with the opportunities you do have." After Maria went to sleep, Frances lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the academy's nighttime routine guards making their rounds, late shift personnel conducting equipment checks, the distant hum of generators keeping essential systems running. She thought about Joseph's words. about the promise she'd made to herself when she applied to the Valerian Academy. She'd come here believing that dedication and skill could overcome initial disadvantages, that preparation could create opportunities. Instead, she'd learned that some institutions were more interested in maintaining existing hierarchies than in discovering unexpected capabilities. The rational choice was clear: accept limitations, complete her assigned training, and find satisfaction in a support role that others had determined suited her capabilities. It was practical, safe, and exactly what everyone expected her to do. But as Frances listened to the Academy's nighttime sounds, she found herself thinking about a different kind of sound, the distinctive rhythm of advanced combat training sessions that she'd been systematically excluded from. Training that was happening just 3 floors above her, where 234 elite trainees were, developing skills that she would never be allowed to learn. The number had become significant to her over the months. 234 warriors in training, all deemed more suitable for combat roles than she was. 234 people who would graduate from the academy with opportunities she'd been told she could never earn. Frances closed her eyes and practiced the breathing techniques Joseph had taught her, centering her mind and releasing the frustration that threatened to consume her. Tomorrow would bring another day of equipment management, another day of being invisible, another day of proving she was satisfied with limitations others had placed on her, unless she decided it wouldn't. The Academy's monthly evaluation ceremony took place on a bright Tuesday morning that should have been routine. Frances stood with the other support staff at the back of the great assembly hall, watching as Commander Krause prepared to announce performance rankings and advancement opportunities. Sunlight streamed through the tall Gothic windows, illuminating the faces of 234 combat trainees, who filled the hall's center rows with anticipation and confidence. Frances had attended 5 of these ceremonies since arriving at the academy, each one a carefully orchestrated reminder of the hierarchy that defined their world. Combat trainees in the center, support staff along the periphery, instructors at the front. Everyone in their designated place, everyone understanding their role in the academy's grand design. Today marks another milestone in your development as warriors, Commander Krause announced, his voice carrying easily through the vaulted space. The monthly evaluations reflect not just individual progress, but your readiness to take on greater responsibilities. Frances listened with practiced detachment as names were called for various honors: combat efficiency awards, tactical innovation recognitions, leadership development appointments. Each announcement was accompanied by applause from the assembled trainees, each recognition another reminder of opportunities that existed in a world she wasn't allowed to enter. Then Krause's tone shifted slightly, taking on the formal cadence he used for serious announcements. This month, we're also implementing a new policy regarding academy personnel and their assigned roles, he said. There have been recent incidents of support staff overreaching their designated functions, studying materials beyond their clearance levels, and expressing inappropriate ambitions regarding combat training. Frances felt every eye in the hall suddenly aware of her presence, though few turned to look directly. The words were general enough to apply to multiple people, but everyone knew exactly who had prompted this policy announcement. Effective immediately, Krause continued, any support personnel found studying restricted materials, attending unauthorized training sessions, or expressing dissatisfaction with their assigned roles will face immediate disciplinary action. The Academy's training structure exists for good reasons, and we will not tolerate attempts to circumvent established protocols. The message was crystal clear. Stay in your lane, accept your limitations, and stop reaching for things beyond your designated place in the hierarchy. But it was what happened next that shattered Frances's carefully maintained composure. To illustrate the importance of understanding one's appropriate role, Krause said, his eyes finding Frances in the crowd, I'm going to ask Specialist Anderson to join me at the front of the hall. Frances felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, support staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, while combat trainees turned to stare at her with curiosity and barely concealed amusement. She'd been singled out, made into an example, turned into a cautionary tale about the dangers of inappropriate ambition. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, her boots clicking against the stone floor in the sudden silence. Every eye in the hall followed her progress. 234 elite trainees and dozens of staff members, all witnessing what was clearly intended to be a humiliation, designed to reinforce established boundaries. Commander Krause waited until she reached the front platform before speaking again. Specialist Anderson represents a common problem in military institutions, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Intelligent, dedicated personnel who mistake academic study for practical capability. Who believe that understanding theory qualifies them for roles requiring physical application. Frances stood at attention, her face burning with embarrassment, but her posture rigidly correct. She could feel the weight of 234 pairs of eyes, could sense the mixture of pity and contempt in the watching faces. The danger, Krause continued, is not just to the individual who overestimates their capabilities, but to any unit that might depend on them in actual combat situations. When people believe they're qualified for roles they're physically unsuited for, they become liabilities rather than assets. The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to underscore her inadequacy in front of everyone who mattered in her professional world. Frances realized that this wasn't just discipline, it was systematic destruction of any credibility she might have had, any possibility that others might take her seriously. Anderson, Krause said, turning to address her directly, do you understand why you were assigned to support roles rather than combat training? The question hung in the air, demanding public acknowledgement of her limitations. Frances could feel the expectation in the room, the certainty that she would accept this humiliation gracefully and confirm everyone's assumptions about her place in the Academy's hierarchy. Sir, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. In her chest, I understand that assignments are made based on initial assessments of capability. Initial assessments that proved accurate, Krause corrected firmly. Your 6 months here have confirmed that you're well suited for support roles and unsuited for combat responsibilities. Do you accept that assessment? Frances looked out at the sea of faces watching her public humiliation. She saw the combat trainees who had dismissed her as library, the instructors who had questioned her dedication, the support staff who had warned her to accept her limitations. 234 elite warriors and dozens of academy personnel, all waiting for her to confirm that she knew her place. The moment stretched until it became unbearable. Frances could feel her grandfather's voice echoing in her memory, could feel 7 years of hidden training burning in her muscles, could feel the weight of every dismissal and every limitation that had been placed on her without ever being tested. Sir, she said, her voice growing stronger, I believe that capability should be demonstrated rather than assumed. The silence that followed was complete and electric. Commander Krause's expression shifted from authoritative confidence to dangerous anger. Are you questioning my professional judgment, Anderson? Frances met his gaze directly, knowing that she was about to cross a line that would change everything. Sir, I'm suggesting that true assessment requires actual testing of capabilities, not just measurement of traditional metrics. The gasps from the assembled audience were audible. Frances had just challenged Commander Krause's expertise in front of the entire Academy, had questioned the fundamental principles that governed their world. Krause's hand moved almost imperceptibly, rising slightly as if preparing to deliver a slap that would punctuate her humiliation and demonstrate the consequences of insubordination. That's when Frances Anderson made the decision that would transform her from a cautionary tale into a legend. Commander Krause's hand hung in the air for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The great hall was so silent that Frances could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. 234 elite trainees watched with fascination as their legendary commander prepared to deliver a humiliating slap to the support staff member who had dared to question his authority. But something in Frances's posture, the way she stood perfectly still, centered and balanced, her eyes never leaving his, made Kraus hesitate. There was no fear in her expression, no flinching anticipation of the blow. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like readiness. "You want to demonstrate capability, Anderson?" Kraus said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several trainees shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You think our assessment methods are inadequate?" Frances felt the weight of the moment, understanding that her next words would either destroy her completely or create an opportunity. She'd been preparing for her entire life. "Sir, I believe that some capabilities can only be properly evaluated through direct demonstration." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Senior Instructor Novak stepped forward, clearly intending to intervene before this situation spiraled further out of control. "Commander," Novak said carefully, "perhaps this discussion would be more appropriate in a private setting." "No," Kraus interrupted, his eyes never leaving Frances's face. "Specialist Anderson wants to demonstrate her capabilities in front of the Academy. I think we should accommodate that request." The words sent a chill through the hall. Everyone understood what was happening. Commander Kraus was about to make an example of Frances that would be remembered for years. A public demonstration of why physical limitations weren't just bureaucratic concerns, but practical realities that could get people killed. "Anderson," Kraus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "you've spent 6 months studying advanced combat techniques. You've memorized joint manipulation procedures, pressure point applications, tactical psychology principles. All theory, of course, since you've never been cleared for practical application." Frances felt her mouth go dry, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, sir." "Then let's test your theories," Kraus said, beginning to remove his uniform jacket. "If you truly believe that traditional assessments are inadequate, prove it. Show these 234 warriors what you think we've missed about your capabilities." The great hall erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Several instructors moved closer to the platform, clearly preparing to intervene if necessary. This was unprecedented. Commander was about to engage in combat demonstration with a support staff member who had been deemed unsuitable for fighting roles. Frances understood the trap that was being set. Kraus was a master combatant with decades of experience, someone who had trained special forces operators across Europe. He was 6 inches taller, 70 pounds heavier, and possessed the kind of practical experience that came from real combat situations. The demonstration was designed to be swift and decisive, a public proof that theoretical knowledge meant nothing without physical capability. "Sir," Frances said quietly, "are you certain you want to do this?" The question drew gasps from the audience. Several trainees actually laughed, assuming she was displaying the kind of delusional confidence that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. Kraus smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm absolutely certain, Anderson. In fact, I insist. You've questioned our methods, suggested our assessments are flawed, implied that you possess capabilities we've failed to recognize. This is your opportunity to prove those claims." Frances looked out at the sea of faces surrounding the platform. She could see the mix of anticipation, concern, and barely concealed excitement in the watching eyes. Some trainees were clearly expecting entertainment, watching the Academy's most delusional support staff member get decisively humbled by their legendary commander. Others seemed worried that they were about to witness something genuinely ugly, a mismatch so complete that it would be painful to watch. But Frances also noticed something else in a few faces: genuine curiosity. A handful of the more thoughtful trainees seemed to be wondering what had given her the confidence to reach this point. Why someone who had seemed intelligent and careful for 6 months would suddenly take such an enormous risk? "Very well, sir," Frances said, beginning to remove her own uniform jacket. "But I have one request." Kraus raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to make requests, Anderson." "I'd like this demonstration to be conducted according to standard academy sparring protocols," Frances said. 3-minute rounds victory. By submission, knockout, or unanimous instructor decision. Full contact, but controlled techniques only. The request was reasonable enough to be difficult to refuse, but Frances had another motive. Academy protocols required that demonstrations be conducted on the main training mats, which would give her better footing than the stone platform. More importantly, the formal structure would prevent Kraus from simply overwhelming her with brute force. He'd have to engage with actual technique. "Acceptable," Kraus agreed, stepping down from the platform toward the training area. "Though I suspect this won't require a full 3 minutes." As they moved toward the center of the hall, Frances caught sight of Maria Santos in the crowd. Her roommate's face was pale with worry, clearly convinced she was about to witness Frances's complete destruction. Other support staff members wore similar expressions, concern mixed with the kind of secondhand embarrassment that came from watching someone make a catastrophic mistake. The combat trainees, however, were energized. This was unprecedented entertainment. A chance to see their revered commander demonstrate the principles they'd been learning in the most direct way possible. Several were already taking bets on how quickly the match would. Frances stepped onto the training mat and felt something shift inside her. For 6 months, she'd been Frances Anderson, the logistics specialist, the quiet girl who counted equipment and filed reports. But this mat was different territory. This was where Joseph's training could finally emerge from hiding. She moved through her pre-combat routine, the breathing exercises and mental preparation that had become second nature. During 7 years of secret training, around her, the hall was buzzing with excitement and anticipation. But Frances felt herself entering the focused calm that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate. Commander Kraus took his position on the opposite side of the mat, his stance confident and relaxed. He'd done this thousands of times before, had sparred with special forces operators, professional fighters, and elite military personnel from across Europe. The small woman facing him represented nothing he hadn't encountered and defeated. Countless times, Senior Instructor Novak stepped forward to serve as referee, her expression grave with the responsibility of overseeing what could be either a demonstration or a disaster. "Standard Academy protocols apply," she announced. 3-minute rounds, controlled contact, victory by submission or knockout. Fighters ready? Frances nodded, her breathing steady and her mind clear. Across the mat, Commander Kraus rolled his shoulders and settled into a combat stance that spoke of decades of experience and absolute confidence. "Begin," Novak called. The legend of Frances Anderson was about to be born. Commander Kraus moved forward with the confident stride of someone who had ended countless sparring matches in the opening seconds. His approach was textbook military combatives, direct, powerful, designed to establish dominance immediately. He threw a straight right hand that would have dropped most opponents, a punch backed by 70 pounds of weight advantage and decades of combat experience. Frances wasn't there when it arrived. She moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics, her small frame flowing around Kraus's attack like water around a stone. The punch passed harmlessly through the space where her head had been a split second earlier, while she simultaneously stepped inside his guard and placed her left hand lightly against his extended elbow. The touch was so gentle it seemed almost casual, but Kraus felt his balance shift unexpectedly. His confident forward momentum became something less controlled, and he found himself taking an extra step to maintain his footing. The crowd's reaction was immediate and confused. They'd expected to see Frances overwhelmed by Kraus's first attack, but instead they'd witnessed something that looked almost like dance. There had been no collision, No decisive impact, just a strange moment where their commander had seemed to lose his balance for no apparent reason. Kraus recovered quickly, his professional instincts taking over. He'd faced tricky opponents before, fighters who relied on movement and timing rather than power. He adjusted his approach, throwing a combination designed to corner Frances against the edge of the mat where her mobility would be limited. Again, Frances wasn't where his strikes expected to find her. She moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch, never seeming to hurry but always being exactly where she needed to be. Kraus's punches cut through empty air while Frances maintained contact with his arms and shoulders, her hands providing subtle guidance that sent his attacks slightly off their intended paths. "What is she doing?" one of the combat trainees whispered to his neighbor. "I don't know," came the reply, "but she's not getting hit." The first minute passed without Kraus landing a single clean strike. His frustration was becoming visible, his movements growing more aggressive as Frances continued to evade and redirect his attacks with techniques that seemed to violate everything the Academy taught about combat physics. But Frances wasn't just defending. As Kraus committed to a powerful overhand right, she stepped inside the arc of his punch and placed her right hand against his wrist, while her left hand found the back of his elbow. The motion looked gentle, almost helpful, as if she were simply guiding his arm in its natural direction of travel. Kraus felt his elbow hyperextend slightly, not enough to cause injury, but enough to send a clear message about what could happen if Frances chose to apply more pressure. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't just evading his attacks, she was controlling them. The crowd was beginning to understand that they weren't watching the mismatch they'd expected. The whispers grew louder, the excitement more genuine. Several instructors moved closer to the mat, their expressions shifting from concern to professional fascination. Senior instructor Novak found herself studying Frances's movement patterns with growing amazement. The techniques weren't part of the Academy's curriculum, weren't anything she'd encountered in 15 years of military combat training. Frances moved like someone who understood principles of leverage and anatomy that went beyond traditional martial arts. Kraus tried to establish a grappling exchange, using his size advantage to force Frances into a strength-based confrontation. He shot forward for a takedown, intending to put her on the ground where technique would matter less than raw physicality. Frances met his attack with perfect timing, her hands finding his shoulders as his momentum carried him forward. Instead of resisting his takedown attempt, she seemed to accelerate it, her body dropping low as she guided his forward motion over her back. Kraus found himself airborne, his own momentum turned against him. He landed hard on the mat, not injured, but definitely surprised. The takedown he'd initiated had somehow become a throw that Frances had controlled from beginning to end. The hall erupted in surprised exclamations. Several trainees stood up from their seats, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Commander Kraus, the legendary fighter who had trained special forces across Europe, had just been thrown by the Academy's smallest support staff member, but Kraus was far from finished. He rolled smoothly back to his feet, his expression now showing genuine respect for Frances's capabilities. The demonstration had stopped being about humiliating an insubordinate subordinate and had become about solving a tactical puzzle that was proving more complex than expected. "Interesting technique, Anderson," he said, his breathing slightly elevated but his voice still controlled. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Frances didn't respond verbally, but her eyes carried a message that Kraus recognized from his own military experience, the look of someone who had trained seriously for a very long time. The second minute began with both fighters showing new respect for their opponent. Kraus approached more cautiously, testing Frances's responses with probing attacks rather than committing to power shots. Frances continued her flowing movement, but now she began to add offensive elements to her defensive repertoire. When Kraus threw a measured jab, Frances caught his wrist and stepped across his body, applying leverage that lifted him slightly. onto his toes. When he tried to counter with a left hook, she ducked under the punch and rose with her shoulder against his ribs, using his own forward momentum to drive him backward. Each exchange demonstrated capabilities that the Academy's assessment process had completely missed. Frances wasn't just surviving against a superior opponent. She was controlling the pace and distance of their engagement, dictating the terms of their interaction in ways that seemed to defy every principle of size and strength advantage. Crowd was now completely engaged, their attention focused on technical details that most of them had never seen before. Combat trainees who had dismissed Frances as library were studying her footwork, trying to understand how she generated leverage without apparent effort. Instructors were taking mental notes on techniques that weren't part of their curriculum, but clearly deserved study. As the second minute concluded, it became clear that this wasn't the demonstration anyone had expected. Commander Kraus wasn't dominating a delusional support staff member. He was engaged in a genuine technical exchange with someone who possessed skills that had been completely overlooked by the Senvu Academy's evaluation process. The question now wasn't whether Frances belonged in combat training. The question was how someone with her capabilities had been relegated to equipment management for 6 months while the Academy's best instructors remained completely unaware of what she could do. But the most important question would be answered. In the final minute, could Frances Anderson actually defeat Commander Victor Kraus in front of 234 elite warriors who had spent 6 months certain that she was nothing more than a logistics specialist with delusions of grandeur? The answer was about to shock everyone in the hall. As the final minute began, Commander Kraus made a critical decision that would seal his fate. Frustrated by his inability to establish dominance through conventional means, he abandoned the controlled techniques of Academy sparring and reached for the combat experience that had made him legendary in European special forces. This was no longer a training demonstration. It was a real fight against an opponent whose capabilities had proven far beyond anything he'd anticipated. Kraus shifted into the aggressive, overwhelming style that had served him in actual combat situations, the kind of ruthless efficiency that ended confrontations decisively. He launched a combination that was designed to break through Frances's defensive flow through sheer violence and commitment. A straight left to occupy her hands, a right cross to follow behind it, and a knee strike timed to catch her if she dropped her guard. It was a sequence that had drop-trained special forces operators, executed with the kind of controlled fury that came from decades of real combat experience. Frances read the change in his intentions immediately. The playful probing was over. Commander Kraus was now fighting to win, and his next combination carried real intent to harm. This was the moment Joseph had prepared her for. The instant when theoretical knowledge would meet genuine violence and only perfect technique would be sufficient. To survive, she moved inside Kraus's combination with timing that seemed almost supernatural. Her left hand intercepted his jab at the wrist, not blocking but redirecting, while her right hand found his elbow as the cross followed behind it. Instead of backing away from his knee strike, she stepped deeper into his attack, her body positioning, making his knee pass harmlessly beside her as she maintained contact with both his arms. For a split second, Frances held Commander Kraus in perfect leverage, his momentum committed forward, his balance compromised, his joints positioned exactly where Joseph's training had taught her they needed to be for maximum mechanical advantage. The hall held its breath as Frances made her choice. She could have applied the joint destruction techniques that 7 years of systema training had ingrained into muscle memory, could have hyperextended Kraus's elbow, could have used his forward momentum to drive him face first into the mat, could have demonstrated the kind of finishing techniques that would have ended the match with serious injury. Instead, she chose control. Frances guided Kraus's momentum into a throw that was both gentle and absolute. She used his own forward motion to lift him completely off the ground, spinning him through the air in a graceful arc that demonstrated perfect understanding of leverage and timing. He landed on his back with force that was substantial but controlled. The impact solid enough to be decisive, but careful enough to avoid injury. Before Kraus could react, Frances had followed him to the ground with positioning that was textbook perfect. Her knee was against his solar plexus, her left hand controlled his right wrist, and her right hand was positioned against his throat with pressure that was unmistakable in its implications. The submission was complete and technically flawless. Commander Kraus lay on his back, controlled by someone a third his size, facing techniques that could have escalated to lethal force if Frances had chosen to apply them. His decades of combat experience told him exactly how vulnerable his position was, how completely his opponent had outmaneuvered him. The Great Hall was absolutely silent. 234 elite trainees stared at the impossible scene before them, their legendary commander held in submission by the quiet logistics specialist they had dismissed as library for 6 months. Senior Instructor Novak stood, frozen with amazement, her referee duties forgotten as she processed what she'd just witnessed. The other instructors moved closer to the mat, their expressions ranging from professional fascination to complete bewilderment. Frances held the position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, short enough to show that she meant no disrespect to Commander Kraus personally. Then she released the submission and stepped back, offering her hand to help him to his feet. Kraus accepted the assistance, rising with the dignified composure of a professional who had just learned something important about combat and assessment. His uniform was disheveled and his breathing was elevated, but his expression showed genuine respect rather than humiliation. "Where did you learn to fight like that, Anderson?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Frances stood at attention, her own breathing controlled despite the intensity of what had just occurred. "My grandfather, sir. Joseph Anderson. He taught me that size determines many things, but not everything." Kraus studied her for a long moment, then turned to address the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him legendary, "you have just witnessed a perfect demonstration of why assessment must be based on capability rather than assumption." The hall remained silent, everyone processing the implications of what they'd just seen. Frances Anderson, the support staff member who had been deemed unsuitable for combat training, had just defeated their most respected instructor using techniques that none of them had encountered before. "Anderson," Kraus continued, "you mentioned that capability should be demonstrated rather than assumed. I believe you've made that point definitively." He paused, looking out at the faces of the 234 combat trainees, who had spent 6 months certain that they understood the hierarchy of capability within the academy. "Effective immediately," Kraus announced. "Specialist Anderson is transferred to advanced combat training. Furthermore, she will be working with our instruction staff to incorporate her techniques into our curriculum. It appears we have something to learn about fighting efficiency that our current program doesn't address." The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Several trainees began talking excitedly, while others sat in stunned silence. The Academy's assessment process, the fundamental system that determined everyone's role and opportunities, had just been revealed as fundamentally flawed. Frances felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion. She'd proven her point, earned her opportunity, and demonstrated capabilities that had been hidden for 6 months. But she'd also just changed the trajectory of her life in ways that would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversation about what they'd witnessed, Commander Kraus approached Frances. "Privately, Anderson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. And I owe this academy a complete review of our assessment procedures. How many other capable people have we overlooked because they didn't fit our expectations?" Frances met his gaze directly. "Sir, I believe that question is worth exploring." Kraus nodded grimly. "I believe you're right. And I believe we have a great deal of work to do." As Frances walked off the training mat, she caught sight of Maria Santos in the crowd. Her roommate's expression had shifted from worry to amazement to something approaching awe. Around Maria, other support staff members were staring at Frances with new understanding. She hadn't been delusional about her capabilities. She'd been systematically underestimated by people who thought they knew what strength looked like. The demonstration was over, but Frances Anderson's real training was just beginning. 3 months after the demonstration that shocked the Valerian Academy, Frances Anderson stood in the same great hall where she had once been humiliated as an example of misplaced ambition. But everything had changed. The Gothic windows still cast their familiar patterns of sunlight across the stone floors, but Frances now stood at the front of the hall as an instructor rather than in the back as forgotten support staff. The Academy's transformation had been as dramatic as her own. Word of the demonstration had spread far beyond the institution's walls, reaching military training facilities across Europe and beyond. The video footage captured by security cameras, and later studied by combat experts worldwide, had become legendary in martial arts and military circles. The sight of a 5'4" logistics specialist defeating a renowned special forces commander had challenged fundamental assumptions about capability and assessment that extended far beyond a single academy. Commander Krauss had proven to be a man of his word. The promised review of assessment procedures had been thorough and revolutionary. Traditional metrics of height, weight, and raw strength were supplemented by evaluations of technical skill, tactical intelligence, and adaptive capability. The Academy's curriculum was expanded to include the principles of leverage-based combat that Frances had demonstrated, creating opportunities for smaller fighters who had previously been excluded from advanced training. But the most significant change was cultural. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined Academy life combat personnel at the top, support staff at the bottom, had been replaced by a more fluid system that recognized diverse forms of capability and contribution. Size no longer determined destiny, and assumptions no longer replaced assessment. Frances found herself at the center of these changes, but not always comfortably. Her demonstration had made her famous within military training circles, turning her from an overlooked logistics specialist into a symbol of hidden potential and institutional change. Combat training facilities across Europe requested her as a guest instructor. Military academies revised their selection criteria. Her techniques were studied, analyzed, and incorporated into training programs she had never heard of. The attention was gratifying but also overwhelming. Frances had spent 6 months being invisible. Suddenly everyone wanted to understand how she had developed capabilities that institutional experts had missed completely. The story of her training with Joseph became part of Academy lore, inspiring other trainees to seek additional development beyond their assigned curricula. More importantly, her success had opened doors for others. Maria Santos, her former roommate, had requested transfer to medical combat training, a hybrid program that combined her natural healing skills with battlefield application. Several other support staff members had been reevaluated and found suitable for roles that matched their actual capabilities rather than institutional assumptions about their limitations. The Academy had discovered that Frances wasn't unique in being underutilized. She was simply the most dramatic example of a systemic problem that had been affecting numerous personnel. The comprehensive review that followed her demonstration identified dozens of people whose talents had been overlooked by traditional assessment methods. On this particular morning, Frances was preparing to conduct her first solo advanced combat seminar. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to teach techniques to some of the same trainees who had dismissed her as library just months earlier. But the dynamic had shifted completely. These weren't reluctant students being forced to acknowledge her expertise. They were eager learners who understood that she possessed knowledge that could enhance their own capabilities. The seminar focused on adaptive combat principles, the techniques that allowed smaller fighters to succeed against larger opponents through superior leverage and timing rather than raw physicality. It was exactly the kind of instruction that the Academy's previous curriculum had ignored. The gap in knowledge that had kept people like Francis relegated to support roles despite their potential. As the trainees filed into the hall, Francis recognized many familiar faces. Thompson, who had once questioned whether someone her size could be trusted in dangerous situations. Rodriguez, who had worried about the physics of smaller fighters carrying injured personnel. Williams, who had watched her unauthorized rescue mission with amazement and newfound respect. But she also saw new faces, recent arrivals to the Academy, who had heard about the changes and specifically requested assignment to an institution that evaluated capability rather than making assumptions about it. The Academy's reputation had evolved from exclusive and traditional to innovative and inclusive, attracting candidates who might previously have been overlooked by military training programs. One year after her demonstration that changed everything, Francis Anderson stood before the largest gathering in Valerian Academy history. The Great Hall had been expanded to accommodate representatives from military training facilities across 5 continents, all attending the inaugural International Conference on Adaptive Combat Assessment. The event had grown from a simple review of Academy procedures into a global symposium that was reshaping military training philosophy worldwide. Francis had become more than an instructor or a symbol of institutional change. She had evolved into a recognized expert whose insights were transforming how military organizations identified and developed combat talent. Her techniques were now taught at academies from West Point to Sandhurst, from the École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force Academy. The principles she had demonstrated in 3 minutes of combat had been systematized, codified, and integrated into training programs that would influence military education for generations. But standing before this distinguished international audience, Francis found herself thinking not about global influence or institutional transformation, but about the individual stories that had made it all meaningful. Alina Kozlov, who had graduated at the top of her combat training class and was now serving as an instructor herself. Maria Santos, whose hybrid medical combat program had become a model for battlefield medic training across Europe. Dozens of other Academy personnel who had found new opportunities when assessment criteria expanded beyond traditional physical metrics. "Ladies and gentlemen," Francis addressed the assembly, her voice carrying easily through the packed hall, "when I first challenged this Academy's assessment procedures, I wasn't trying to revolutionize military training. I was simply trying to prove that I deserved the chance to serve according to my capabilities rather than others' assumptions about my limitations." The audience included generals, defense ministers, academy commandants, and training experts whose combined experience represented centuries of military education. Many had initially been skeptical about reports of revolutionary changes at a small European combat academy. Others had come expecting to observe interesting, but ultimately limited innovations that wouldn't translate to their own institutions. Instead, they had witnessed a fundamental shift in how capability could be identified, assessed, and developed. The Academy's graduates were performing exceptionally in field assignments, demonstrating that diverse approaches to combat training produced more adaptable and effective military personnel. Traditional metrics hadn't been abandoned, but they had been supplemented with evaluations that recognized intelligence, technique, and adaptability as equally important components of combat effectiveness. "The lesson of the past year," Francis continued, "isn't that physical capability is unimportant, but that it's insufficient as the sole measure of military potential. Every person in this room has encountered individuals whose contributions exceeded what traditional assessment would have predicted. Our challenge is creating institutional systems that identify and develop those contributions systematically. Commander Kraus, now promoted to Academy Director in recognition of his leadership during the institutional transformation, stepped forward to present the conference's key findings. The research data was impressive. Academies that had implemented adaptive assessment protocols were graduating personnel with higher performance ratings, lower attrition rates, and superior adaptability in field assignments. But the most significant evidence came from combat units that had incorporated graduates trained under the new protocols. These units demonstrated enhanced operational effectiveness, particularly in complex environments that required diverse skill sets and adaptive problem solving. The integration of differently capable personnel hadn't compromised unit performance. It had enhanced it in ways that homogeneous units couldn't match. During the afternoon sessions, Francis conducted practical demonstrations for the international observers. She worked with students who represented the Academy's new diversity, men and women of various sizes and backgrounds, all united by demonstrated capability rather than conformity to traditional physical profiles. The techniques they displayed were elegant and effective, showing how proper training could enable anyone to contribute meaningfully to combat operations. But the most powerful moment came when Elena Kozlov, now a junior instructor, sparred with Major Harrison from the British Army's Parachute Regiment. Harrison was a decorated veteran whose physical specifications would have made him an ideal candidate under any traditional assessment system. Elena, meanwhile, represented everything that conventional military wisdom said couldn't succeed in. High-level combat roles. The match lasted 4 minutes and ended with Harrison tapping out to a joint lock that demonstrated perfect understanding of leverage and timing. But more importantly, it ended with Harrison asking Elena to teach him the technique she had employed, recognizing that her approach to combat offered insights that could enhance his own effectiveness. This, Francis told the assembled observers, is what institutional transformation looks like in practice. Not the replacement of traditional capability with alternative capability, but the integration of diverse capabilities into more effective combined approaches. The conference concluded with the signing of the Valerian Accord, a formal agreement among participating institutions to implement comprehensive capability assessment protocols that would identify and develop military talent regardless of traditional physical limitations. 23 countries committed to revising their training academy admission criteria, incorporating technical skill evaluation alongside physical testing. But for Francis, the most meaningful moment came during the evening reception when she encountered General Patricia Morrison, the first woman to command a Special Forces unit in the United States Army. Morrison had traveled from Washington specifically to meet Francis, having heard about the Academy's transformation through military intelligence networks. "Miss Anderson," Morrison said, "what you've accomplished here represents something I've been advocating for throughout my career. You've proven that military effectiveness isn't determined by fitting a single profile, but by maximizing diverse forms of capability within unified command structures." Francis accepted the recognition with gratitude, but found herself thinking about Joseph, whose training had made everything possible. Her grandfather had passed away 2 months earlier, but not before learning about the international recognition his techniques had received. His funeral had been attended by military personnel from across Europe, all honoring a man whose influence had extended far beyond a small village outside Prague. "General Morrison," Francis replied, "the real proof won't be in conferences or accords, but in the field performance of personnel who were given opportunities they wouldn't have received under traditional assessment. That's where we'll measure whether these changes actually improve military effectiveness." As the reception continued, Francis found herself surrounded by Academy graduates who had benefited from the expanded assessment protocols. They represented a new generation of military personnel whose careers had been shaped by the principle that capability should be demonstrated rather than assumed. Their success would determine whether her transformation of institutional culture would endure beyond the immediate enthusiasm of international recognition. The evening concluded with Frances walking through the academy's corridors, noting changes that had become so routine they were barely noticeable. Mixed gender, mixed size training groups working together on complex tactical problems. Technical libraries that were accessible to all personnel, regardless of their assigned specializations. Assessment procedures that evaluated multiple forms of capability rather than relying on single metrics. But the most significant change was cultural. The academy now attracted candidates who specifically sought an institution that would evaluate their potential comprehensively rather than making assumptions about their limitations. The applicant pool had diversified dramatically, bringing talents and perspectives that enhanced the educational experience for everyone. Frances paused outside her old dormitory room, remembering the lonely evenings when she had studied forbidden materials while listening to the excited conversations of combat trainees down the hall. That isolation seemed like ancient history now, replaced by an environment where curiosity and preparation were celebrated rather than suspected. The transformation was complete, but Frances understood that maintaining institutional change required constant vigilance. Future leaders would need to remember why these changes had been necessary, would need to resist the natural tendency to revert to simpler, but less accurate assessment methods. Her legacy wasn't the techniques she had developed, or the demonstration that had made her famous. Her legacy was an institutional culture that would continue identifying and developing unconventional talent long after she had moved on to other challenges. The legend of Frances Anderson would endure, but more importantly, the principles she had proven would continue creating opportunities for others who possessed capability that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics alone. 2 years after the demonstration that changed her life and transformed an institution, Frances Anderson stood once again in the great hall of Valerian Academy. But this time, she wasn't facing a hostile tribunal or conducting a desperate proving ground. She was saying goodbye to the place that had become synonymous with her name, preparing to accept a position that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived as an overlooked logistics specialist. The International Defense Advisory Council had offered her the role of Director of Adaptive Training Development, a newly created position that would coordinate military education reform across 37 countries. It was recognition that extended far beyond personal achievement. It was acknowledgement that the principles she had proven at Valerian Academy were essential for modern military effectiveness in an increasingly complex global environment. Farewell ceremony brought together representatives from every aspect of her journey. Commander Krauss, whose willingness to admit error and embrace change had made institutional transformation possible. Alina Kozlov and dozens of other students whose careers had been shaped by expanded assessment protocols. Military observers from around the world who had witnessed the practical benefits of recognizing diverse forms of capability. But the most meaningful presence was that of Joseph's photograph, displayed prominently at the front of the hall. Frances's grandfather had not lived to see the full scope of what his training had accomplished, but his influence was evident in every technique being taught, every assessment protocol being implemented, every student who was given opportunities that traditional evaluation would have denied. When I first arrived at this academy, Frances addressed the assembled crowd. I was convinced that talent and preparation would eventually create opportunities for recognition. I was naive about how resistant institutions can be to changing their fundamental assumptions about capability and potential. She paused, looking out at faces that represented a generation of military personnel whose careers had been shaped by the changes she had catalyzed. Combat instructors were teaching techniques developed by someone they had initially dismissed as unsuitable for fighting roles. Assessment protocols were identifying talent that previous systems would have overlooked. Training programs were producing graduates whose diverse capabilities enhanced rather than compromised unit effectiveness. What I learned, Francis continued, is that individual transformation is meaningless without institutional change, and institutional change is impossible without individual courage. The demonstration that made my reputation lasted 3 minutes, but the real work required 2 years of systematic effort to prove that alternative approaches could enhance rather than replace traditional military training. The ceremony included presentations of research data that had convinced skeptical military establishments worldwide. Academy graduates trained under expanded assessment protocols were achieving superior performance ratings in field assignments. Combat units incorporating diverse personnel profiles were demonstrating enhanced operational effectiveness. Military organizations that had implemented comprehensive CAPABILATY evaluation were attracting higher quality candidates and reducing personnel attrition. But the most compelling evidence came from Elena Kozlov, who had been selected to represent the new generation of military personnel whose careers had been enabled by institutional change. Elena's achievements had exceeded even Francis's expectations. Top graduate of advanced combat training, successful completion of special operations qualification, and selection for an elite counter-terrorism unit that operated across European theater. Miss Anderson, Elena addressed Francis directly, changed more than assessment procedures at this academy. She changed what we understand about human potential and how institutions can either limit or enhance the development of that potential. Her legacy isn't just in the techniques we've learned, but in the opportunities we've been given to prove what we're capable of achieving. The formal ceremony concluded with the presentation of the Academy Medal of Distinguished Service, Valerian's highest honor for contributions to military education. Francis accepted the recognition, knowing that similar medals would be more meaningful when they were awarded to future graduates, whose potential had been identified through comprehensive rather than limited assessment. As the crowd dispersed, Francis found herself walking through academy facilities that bore physical testament to the changes she had initiated. Training areas designed for diverse body types and fighting styles. Library collections that were accessible to all personnel regardless of their assigned specializations. Dormitory arrangements that reflected integrated rather than segregated approaches to military education. But the most significant changes were invisible. Cultural shifts that would influence military training long after specific policies had been revised or updated. The Academy now operated on the principle that capability should be demonstrated rather than assumed. That diversity of approach could enhance rather than compromise operational effectiveness. That individual potential was worth systematic institutional effort to identify and develop. Francis's final meeting was with Commander Krauss, whose own career had been enhanced by his willingness to acknowledge error and lead institutional change. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to collaborative, to genuinely friendly, built on shared commitment to maximizing human potential within military structures. Anderson, Krauss said, using her surname with the respect that had replaced his initial dismissal. What you've accomplished here will influence military education for decades. But I'm curious, what do you see as the next challenge for adaptive training development? Francis had been thinking about that question throughout the farewell process. Her new position would involve working with military organizations worldwide, many of which were still operating under assessment philosophies that limited rather than maximized their personnel development potential. The next challenge, she replied, is proving that these principles work not just in academic settings, but in actual combat operations. We've demonstrated that diverse approaches to training can produce effective graduates, but we need to show that diverse operational units can achieve superior mission success rates. It was an ambitious goal that would require years of careful research and systematic implementation. But Francis had learned that institutional change was possible when supported by clear evidence of improved outcomes. The techniques that had made her famous were now being tested in real-world military operations, and preliminary results suggested that diverse unit composition enhanced rather than compromised operational effectiveness. As Frances prepared to leave Valerian Academy for the final time, she encountered Maria Santos, whose own career trajectory illustrated the personal impact of institutional change. Maria was now directing the Academy's integrated medical combat program, training battlefield medics whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional medical support roles. "Frances," Maria said, "I wanted to thank you one more time for what you made possible here. Not just for me personally, but for everyone who benefited from your willingness to challenge assumptions about capability and potential." Frances accepted the gratitude, but found herself thinking about the broader implications of institutional transformation. The changes at Valerian Academy represented more than military education reform. They demonstrated that established systems could adapt to recognize and develop human potential more comprehensively when individuals were willing to prove that alternative approaches were possible. Her final act at the Academy was visiting the memorial garden where Joseph's photograph had been permanently installed. Her grandfather's image was surrounded by plaques honoring other individuals whose contributions to military training had been recognized posthumously. But Joseph's plaque was different. It acknowledged not just his personal achievements, but his role in developing the techniques that had transformed modern approaches to combat effectiveness assessment. Standing before his memorial, Frances reflected on the journey that had brought her from overlooked logistics specialist to internationally recognized expert in military training development. The path had required more courage than she had initially possessed, more persistence than she had imagined would be necessary, and more systematic effort than any individual achievement could justify. But it had also proven that institutional change was possible when individuals were willing to demonstrate alternative approaches rather than simply advocating for them. Her 3-minute confrontation with Commander Krauss had created ripple effects that were still expanding, influencing military education policies across multiple continents and creating opportunities for countless individuals whose potential would have been overlooked under traditional assessment systems. As Frances left Valerian Academy for her new international role, she carried with her the knowledge that individual transformation could catalyze institutional change, that diverse approaches to capability could enhance rather than compromise organizational effectiveness, and that human potential was worth systematic effort to identify and develop regardless of how unconventional its expression might initially appear. The legend of Frances Anderson would endure in military training circles, but her real legacy was an institutional culture that would continue creating opportunities for unexpected talent long after her own career had concluded. She had proven that size didn't determine strength, that assumptions couldn't replace assessment, and that courage to challenge established limitations could transform entire systems of human development. The commander who had once sought to slap her into submission had instead become her strongest advocate. The 234 warriors who had dismissed her as irrelevant had instead learned techniques that enhanced their own effectiveness. The institution that had relegated her to equipment management had instead been transformed into a model for comprehensive capability development. Frances Anderson walked away from Valerian Academy, knowing that her greatest victory wasn't personal recognition, but systemic change that would benefit individuals she would never meet, whose potential would be recognized because others had fought battles to expand what institutions understood about human capability. The story that had begun with humiliation and dismissal had ended with transformation and possibility. And for Frances, that was the most meaningful victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.